Hello, my name is Eloisa Garcia Mendez, and I will be presenting the 2011 Japan's earthquake and Chile's response to the 2010 earthquake that they went through. One of the reasons why I decided to compare these two countries was because despite of the differences that they have, either geographically and also cultural traits that they each do, they have both managed to establish the really well emergency management and crisis communication protocols. To many, for example, according to the New York Times, Japan has been qualified as being the best country that's prepared for a dual disaster of an earthquake and a tsunami. In the case of Chile, it has also been noted how the response that the Chilean government had was a phenomenal trait and how this helps to save many lives. Now, the earthquake, or as they also call it, the triple disaster in Japan, had a very deep impact in Japanese economy and society, because it wasn't only an earthquake, but it was also a tsunami and a nuclear disaster. As you can see, the earthquake happened in the ocean, the earthquake epicenter, and this affected immediately the island, as well and created a tsunami wave that destroyed many coastal towns. Now, this had also a very difficult thing to manage, and which was the weakness of the Japanese response, which was the nuclear response, how they managed the nuclear response to the nuclear disaster. We will talk about it later, but that's been one of the main weaknesses noted in Japan. On the contrary, for example, Chile had its epicenter in the middle of the country, and this affected 5 out of the 10 regions the country has, right here in the middle of the country, and very close to Santiago, the capital. This meant that 140,000 kilometers of the Chilean coast were destroyed or affected. 12 million inhabitants, which represents about 75% of the population, were directly affected by this, and the losses added up to 29.7 billion. Now, it is important to note that a lot of cultural traits went into this, how they prepared for this disaster. For example, Japan is obviously an island. Because it is an island, they really take care of their resources, because they know that aid is not going to get to them on time if it actually does. And it has also built a lot of resilience towards their buildings. However, Chile, for example, even though it's in Latin America and it has borders with Argentina, Peru, and Bolivia, they also consider themselves an island because they are divided by the Pacific Ocean on the east. They're on the west, On the east, they have the Andes, right over here. On the north, they have the Atacama Deserts, one of the most deadly deserts in the world. And in the south, they have Patagonia. So since the Pinochet years, which were their dictatorship, they've noticed this trait, and they've really worked towards improving it. Now, the approach and the organization of both countries is led by the head of the government. In the case of Japan, it's by the Prime Minister, and in the case of Chile, it's by the then President Michelle Bachelet. Now, this is important to note because it is very different from how the United States deals with this crisis. The United States has a federalist system, and each state is responsible for their response teams, as well as we've seen FEMA. Now, with these two countries, because they're centralist republics, they deal with disasters differently. Like I said, the disaster response is headed by the head of the government, Prime Minister, and President. And for example, in Chile, they did a very interesting approach, which was dividing the system in two. The first one was emergency management, everything related to emergency management. And the second phase was the reconstruction management. Now, this was also aided by obviously the municipalities and the local cities and their governments, as well as by international cooperation. Now, the way Japan deals with disaster is a bit different. They go on the ladder scale, which means that the national system injects the order to the prefectural system. Then the prefectural system orders it to the municipalities, and then it goes as far as to reaching local residents. Now, this has been a very effective approach, but it can be considered to be a bit slower than the Chilean one. Now, we will see how these two have great strengths, but they've also shown many weaknesses. One of the main strengths that both countries can be considered to have is the preparedness of its people. In the case both of Japan and Chile, the local population knew exactly what to do. They followed rules, they were certainly trained for them, and they were used to it. Japan goes as far as having devices where you go in and it shakes in the way that an earthquake would shake you. Now, in Chile too, people knew exactly what to do. They knew where to evacuate. There were specific evacuation zones, and people knew about it. So this shows that the country had prepared its population in case of an earthquake and tsunami. Now, the second strength was the first responders' response. We will see that in Chile, for example, communication failed. We will see that later in their weaknesses, but because their first responders and their population were so well trained and so well informed, they actually managed to be without any leadership from the central command for about 72 hours, which is very impressive. On the contrary, for example, the Japanese government, because they had strict protocols on what to do, the emergency responders responded quickly and effectively. So that is one of the two main strengths that they have, and we can link them with being prepared. The third one, this picture that you see is it's the first tallest building in Latin America, and it's built in Santiago, Chile's capital. Now, many of us have asked us, why would they build such a building if they have so many earthquakes? And it's because of the safe and up to standards protocols that the Chilean government has, which can be equal to the Japanese ones. They also go as far as, in their seismic code, establishing a 10-year liability for the people that build this. So this has actually had a really good effect on construction companies, because they become liable if something happens to the building in case of an emergency. Lastly, for strengths is foreign aid. Now, when I was researching for this paper, I noticed that Chile, especially, and Japan as well, had rejected foreign aid in the first stages of the crisis. Now, after a triple disaster and a dual disaster, a lot of people asked, why would these two countries decide to do this? And it's actually a very good way of managing what you're getting. The Chilean government, for example, waited until first responders in very difficult areas got back to them and said, look, this is what we need. We need water, we need medicines, we don't need mattresses. And that way, foreign aid was channelized to actually meet the requirements that the country needed. In the case of Japan, for example, they do the same thing, but it's usually because they want to help the local's economy to grow. They want to help the local merchant, they want to help the local shops, even if they're destroyed, because that is a way of them to reinforce and restart their economy. So in a way, even though a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, both the president and the prime ministers were very criticized by this, they actually made a right choice by channeling which type of aid and where this aid would go to. Now, I wanted to mention too that the Chilean earthquake compared to the Haitian earthquake that hit in the same year is nothing alike. In the Haitian earthquake, for example, the country lost 273,000 people. And here in Chile, about 400 people lives were lost. So this shows how Chile has really made the effort, has made the commitment to actually be prepared for these sort of disasters. However, even though they do have very good and strong traits, they did fail in certain things.